In that case, I believe it should be time to get started. Allie, are you okay with getting rolling? Fantastic. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Allison Gleason. I'm from Delaware County Community College, and I am one of the co-chairs of the 47th Annual Delaware Valley Student Affairs Conference. And on behalf of myself, my conference chair, Frank Stern, and the entire conference planning committee, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second of our first ever virtual slate of programs. And although the pandemic has thrown a wrench into our normal conference planning process, we're excited to provide the same quality experience, but in a virtual format. The DVSAC Planning Committee has been hard at work since June to try and make these a success. Much like any well-planned program, the success is a result of the combined effort of our dedicated team. So our planning committee is a group of student affairs professionals from around the region and have been leveraging their talents in their spare time, because who has that, to put the conference together. At this time, the committee chairs would like to acknowledge them for all of their work. So if you get a chance, please, maybe in the chat, join us in thanking the committee for their time, effort, creativity, and dedication. That being said, new members are always welcome on the committee and bring us some new ideas. So if you would like to get involved, please let us know via the reception area and fill out our interest form. After the sessions this month, we would then reach out to you as we begin to plan again. And we have just a few housekeeping items. You can feel free to scroll down on the viewing page to get a full session description and the bios of our lovely speakers. And as a reminder, only presenters are going to be given access to share audio and video. So please use the session chat to comment or ask questions. We will have a dedicated question and answer time following our presentations, and we'll be sure to monitor the chat for all of those questions. And finally, I would like to introduce our DVSAC committee member, Allie Moots, who is going to be helping to facilitate our session today. Allie?
Hi. Thank you, Allison. Hi, everyone. My name is Allison Moots. I'm the Vice President, Dean of Students at Manor College, and I'm also the Marketing Co-Chair for DVSAC. I'll be moderating today's panel, Mental Health and Wellbeing in 2021, Implications for Higher Education. While our country continues to grapple with the COVID-19 pandemic, racial injustice, and social unrest, colleges and universities are confronted with the repercussions on the mental health and emotional well-being of students and higher education professionals. This session features a panel discussion that addresses the emotional toll from the COVID-19 pandemic and concerns about racial and social unrest that have increased anxiety, depression, and suicidal thoughts in higher education communities, as well as examine strategies to persist through the emotional stressors of this time. Today's panel presentation is in partnership with the Higher Education Suicide Prevention Coalition, and our first panelist is Dr. Matthew Winterstein, the Director of Higher Education Suicide Prevention. He is also Associate Professor and Director of Research in the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at Sidney Kimmel Medical College at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia. His grant-funded work supports his role as facilitator of the Pennsylvania Higher Education Suicide Prevention Coalition. Dr. Winterstein was a consultant to the National Center for the Prevention of Youth Suicide, serves on Pennsylvania Governor Tom Wolf's Suicide Prevention Task Force, and is on the executive board of Prevent Suicide PA. After spending nearly a decade as the co-chair of the Pennsylvania Youth Suicide Prevention Initiative. Our next panelist is Margaret Valletta, Director of Counseling and Wellness Services at Davis and Elkins College in Elkins, West Virginia. She provides clinical counseling services, crisis intervention services, and outreach, awareness, and prevention programming to students. Her prior experience includes counseling in a community health setting and facilitating leadership programming for adolescent youth in West Virginia as part of a nonprofit educational corporation. She is a licensed professional counselor in West Virginia and a nationally certified counselor. And our final presenter is Georgette Hall Peterson, the Director of Counseling Center for Wellness and Pastoral Clinical Mental Health Counseling Adjunct Professor at Newman University. In 2012, Georgette obtained her position at Newman University as a mental health counselor before being named Director of Counseling in 2017. Georgette is an adjunct professor in the graduate program for Pastoral Clinical Mental Health Counseling, where she has taught for 10 years. After graduating from Newman, Ms. Hall Peterson started her own counseling practice and continues to practice privately, now known as Faith Walk Counseling Services. Georgette also facilitates retreats and presents workshops and training for churches, civic organizations, and universities surrounding many topics, including women's issues, marriage, spirituality, grief, and mental health. So welcome to all of our presenters. Thank you so much for being here today. As your moderator, I'll be asking the questions, and then you can take turns answering. If you don't have an answer to that particular question, it's totally fine. But let's get started if you're all ready. So our first question is, when we look back to 11 months ago, most colleges and universities were delivering counseling and mental health services in person. As mental health professionals, can you share with us your thoughts on how you and your fellow mental health professionals initially responded to the COVID-19 pandemic to provide a continuity of care?
Always turns into who wants to start, right? Well, I'll just say up front, so I don't work fully within our counseling center at Jefferson. I do a lot of other things. I do see some students in our follow-up kind of piece of it. And then, as Margaret certainly knows, for months on end, we've been having conversations with college campuses all over the region, including all the way down to West Virginia, where Margaret's been a part of this and looking at those kinds of things. And I think that the answer to that question is probably different depending on what college campus you're talking about. So for example, at Jefferson, we'd already moved into the world of telehealth because we're part of a psychiatry department. That's where our counseling center is physically located. And so consequently, moving to telehealth was not a stretch by any means for us, and became a very natural piece of what we were doing. Easier said than done, I suspect, for some of the campuses that had never even explored that option in the past. And certainly telehealth creates, and we can talk about this a little bit later down the road, is it creates all kinds of avenues for when does counseling start and when does it end. And even in terms of the academic school year and summertime and things of that nature. So there was a transition for us definitely in that direction, and for college campuses that had been looking at this platform before, they were, I think, more ready to move in that direction. But again, who would have predicted this is where we'd be right now, a year ago? So.
In terms of colleges and universities who were not using telehealth as a platform, Newman was one of those universities. We were not using it, and we were planning on last summer developing a paperless intake form. And so the first thing that happened once our students were sent home was we had to quickly flip the switch and figure out how to continue to help students. That was the priority after we were stunned with the fact that everybody was going to be home and we were going to be working on computers. So personally, professionally, we had to get beyond that first. And then once we got beyond that, it's how do we continue to help students? Because they needed us, if they needed the center before, they certainly need the center even more, and the counselors even more now. And so in about 2 weeks, we had to investigate, explore, develop an intake form, see what our platform could provide for us in terms of that. We use Titanium. So we had to flip the switch and make everything go online in terms of the intake form, the consent forms. Telemental health provides great opportunities, but also presents some challenges in that now our students are home, and our students might be in Colorado or Canada or West Virginia. So can we continue to serve those students and meet with those students? So all those things had to happen behind the scenes, along with finding an appropriate platform to meet with students. And we're on this Hopin, which I've never heard of, but at this point I've heard in a lot of different platforms, DocSeeMe and Zoom especially. So Newman had access to Teams. And contacting our IT department, they could do the research and find out that we could use Teams for this and that it would provide what we needed in terms of being able to have a waiting room, letting people in, keeping people out, and all those things that needed to happen. So I would say in a matter of about 2.5, 3 weeks, we were able to pivot, turn everything around, and make the counseling center virtually available to our students. And I say that in a sense with a source of pride, because I think that long after that, there were schools who were still struggling with that, still trying to figure that out as we were beginning to provide those services. At we found other ways in the meantime to fill the gap with students, to stay in communication with students so that we didn't drop the ball when it came to them. And then when the platform became available, when we figured all those things out, we immediately sent out an email to the whole campus to say, this is how students can get in touch with us. And we moved forward from there. We did not think it would be 11 months later and we'd still be having this conversation, but here we are. So that's what happened at Newman University, and that's how we we flipped that switch, as I said, and pivoted to be able to make our services more available for our students. And the other questions you have will allow me to talk about some of those other things that came after. Thank you.
So I just wanted to say also thank you to the conference committee and to Dr. Winterstein and SPC for inviting me to participate today. It's really, an honor to be able to present for you all and to speak about this really important topic. So, so I think our experience here was similar to yours at Newman's. We had not been offering telehealth previously. It was a pretty smooth switch for us, blessedly, because we had an electronic medical record software that we were already using that had telehealth built in that we could do as an add-on. So really, I think one of the takeaways for me was just how this was, I think, a harder adjustment maybe for us as student affairs professionals and student life professionals and counseling professionals than it was for the students, right? In terms of adjusting to this new technology, becoming comfortable with this new technology. So that was something that I, really took away, was how could the students kind of educate me on their comfort with this technology and the ways that we could use it to still be able to reach them. Certainly, the challenges of the state lines and students going home and not being able to practice over state lines came up. So I think the other takeaway for us here, and I'm sure for many other colleges, was how do we also reach students outside of these individual and group counseling platforms? If we can't be seeing them in these clinical settings because they're now home and we don't have the ability to see them through telehealth, because of licensure, requirements and such, how are we providing some of these other like asynchronous and synchronous ways to really reach them and still have these conversations about mental health and wellness and engage them in those conversations, even if we can't be seeing them clinically? So those were all things that, we kind of explored, and what are the ways that we do that through newsletters, social media campaigns, these, virtual groups that people were able to start. And so I think we learned a lot from that.
Great, thank you. If I could just ask everyone, when you're not answering a question, to just put yourself on mute. We're getting a little feedback. Thank you. Okay, our next question. The pandemic has extended much longer than many would have predicted at the beginning of 2020. What trends are you seeing related to mental health in the higher ed community?
Well, I think one of the trends that we're seeing is the fact that this doing this remotely and using the computer screen to stare at actually does work. I think that's one of the trends. It's working. Students are showing up. Students are requesting services, and there's continuity of care, and they do have, to your point, Margaret, they do have a comfort level with this that I didn't have, and I don't even think that we anticipated that they would be so comfortable with it. And so I think one of the trends is that this will continue for us at Newman. We'll offer, a visit in person, but I think we'll continue to offer a visit virtually if students are more comfortable with that. The other thing I think is a trend is we have been able to provide programming virtually, and it's relatively successful. So being creative with the programming and thinking outside of the box, I think that's another trend, that more outside the box. The possibilities now have expanded because of this pandemic. We've had to switch the way we think, expand our thinking, and therefore what we can offer and how we can offer it has expanded. So I think that it becomes one of the trends also. Just being able to, for students to have the availability of a counselor that they have virtually, whether it's snowing outside, as it has been here in the Northeast, regardless of what's going on weather-wise, or they can still have access to a counselor. And so I think that in terms of the threshold being even lower, through this pandemic, it becomes even lower, and we're more available as a counseling center to students than we had before. So one of the trends is, I think, more students, and we've seen that, an uptick in the numbers for several reasons. There was already predicted uptick in the number, and everyone who works in the counseling center probably saw it, because there's an uptick in anxiety and depression among the age group that is entering colleges and universities. In the past, where those students might not have gotten into college and universities, they are getting in now. So we're also seeing an uptick in the numbers of students with mental health challenges who need the counseling center. So I also think that the trend is going to be, and hopefully going to be, that there will be more provided on campuses in terms of mental health, because I think what the pandemic has brought to light is, we already knew it, those of us who are providers, but what is brought to light is 2 or 3 people in a counseling center is far from enough. Even in a school the size of Newman, it is far from enough. And so I think one of the trends is, hopefully, fingers and toes crossed, that more people will be hired to do these works on counseling centers on colleges and university campuses.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think that the demand far outweighs the availability of services. Interestingly, though, on a college campus, I'd say one of the trends that I've noticed is that the availability of services on a college campus actually is still significantly higher than what would happen if you tried to refer somebody outside of college campus to get some support. A national trend, just in terms of behavioral health in general, is that there's an increased number of people reaching out for services. Again, as Georgette pointed out, largely around depression and anxiety, and so you're seeing a lot more of that stuff going on. You're seeing a lot more family conflict and things from that perspective. And so as a result of that, you have a overtaxed behavioral health community all over the place, and college counseling centers have, for the last, I don't know what you ladies think, but I mean, over the last 10 years have kind of reimagined and kind of reorganized a little bit about how they do counseling. It used to be that you could pick up a student their freshman year and you'd find some way to see them for the next 4 years, and that would be kind of what you do. And there's a lot of college campuses that have thrown that out the window because of the fact that the stigma around mental health has gone down tremendously on college campuses. More students have had some familiarity with this before they've shown up in the first place. And so they're seeking services, and they're asking for services, and they're looking for support, so they're limiting the number of sessions that students can have. And then, of course, with this increased demand, you have that side of it too. The other trend that I would say is a common thing is that the clinical presentation is a little bit different now too, but how they manage it and what resources students have for them between appointments and so forth is very different now than it is typically, particularly for colleges that are either in a hybrid model or their students are doing remote learning, where they would typically be on campus somewhere and around thousands of other students and living in dorms and apartments and things of that nature. You've got a lot more people either in isolation because they're in those settings, but there's not as many other people around them, or they're back at home. And we can make assumptions that back at home is a good thing, but that's not always a good thing. And you've got students that are doing therapy sessions in their cars because at home they don't have a private place to do that. They're trying to do it by telephone as opposed to a video. For better or worse, the video feature actually, I think, is better than just a plain telephone call. Seeing somebody in any format's better than not seeing them at all. But you have realities that go along with it. So I think one of the trends that we're seeing, as Georgette was also alluding to, is the delivery and how we do this, I think, is a little bit different. And we got to be, aware that this platform probably isn't going to go away. It's going to really depend on, once everybody's back fully on campus and everyone feels a lot more comfortable, doing things a little bit more similar to the way that we used to before. What's that going to look like? What's going to be virtual and what's going to be live, and how are we going to manage those things? So I think those are a couple of things that I would think about around that.
I think in terms of just also some health trends that we're seeing. Some of this is probably just more anecdotal of what I've been seeing with our students here at D&E, but problems at home are, for one of the first times, at least in my time, and this is my 5th academic year, are surpassing sometimes the stresses of being in school and their academic stresses, right? So typically, you have students that are presenting with a lot of, social stress, academic stress, and now it seems like a lot more of that stress is focused at home because of, all of these things that families are having to navigate with the pandemic. And so I think as counselors, as student life and student affairs professionals, it's really important for us to be continuing to think about the social services that are available and that we can be, trying to work with these students to be able to access, because, things like food insecurity at home, right? Things that students may not have had to worry about, or their families may not have had to worry about, are now worrying about that in a very real and different way. Job loss, grief of losing family members, right? Thankfully, I don't think we've seen as many of our students, affected possibly by COVID in terms of an illness, but students losing family members and, grief happening at home. So that's something that I think has been a trend, that more of those stressors from home are really affecting and impacting their experience, whether they're on campus or still at home, because I know there are campuses that don't have students back, maybe physically yet. And then I've been thinking a lot about this sort of model of how we respond to collective trauma, right? The fact that, communities, there's this sort of this impact of the trauma, and then there's this sort of period of they call it the heroism and community cohesion period, where everybody's coming together, and there are some positives and there's hopeful things that people are really thinking about, people coming together and doing good things for each other. And then you go into this sort of, period of disillusionment and working towards, this reconstruction and processing the grief of what has happened. And I think what is so different about this pandemic compared to, say, a natural disaster, right, is that it's not, we don't know where the end of this is, right? We don't know what that looks like. So not to be, to be negative, to be hopeful and say that, I think that we know that we're moving much more towards that period where, students are going to be able to really, kind of reconstruct what life is like for them now, and process all the things that have happened. But I think, we as professionals need to be aware that might still be coming. I don't think we've seen sort of the major uptick even in mental health concerns that we're going to see when things actually start to kind of get back to, sort of a new normal in the way that we're thinking it will soon.
Thank you. That's a really good. I haven't actually thought about that in terms of our counseling center. So it's nice to think of future. Right now, we're very focused on what's happening right now and trying to get through what's, in our immediate, view. But I think that's a good perspective. Our next question is, a JED Foundation survey conducted during the fall 2020 semester found that 63% of students said that their mental health is worse than before the COVID pandemic, and 56% of students are significantly concerned with their ability to care for their mental health. Does this resonate with what you're seeing on your campuses?
I don't know, but I would say yes. I think there's a reality. In the fall, you had students that were uncertain as to what that semester would look like for them. There was greater isolation in the fall than in any previous semester that they've, if they've been in college for a few years, than they've experienced before. So you certainly see the isolation, the loneliness. And again, to Margaret's point, I think she's right, is that some of the things that are showing up in college counseling centers as topics for therapy were not things that were the primary discussion points in the past, and those things were popping out a little bit more. And so you had that, and mixed with the inability, or I shouldn't say inability, but the less availability for students to get out there and to socialize and be around others in ways in which they had done in the past. That was a way in which a lot of students felt like they were handling their own mental health. They were getting out and being around other people and just doing things. Whereas right now it's, you do school, you do work if you do work, and you do sleep, and you do school, and you do work, and so it's like the enjoyable things in life are a little bit more complicated to address these days for some of our students. And the complication of that then is you know, how am I managing myself? It's the self-care piece that students haven't quite figured out how to do just yet.
Yeah, I think that I know I kind of ended on a negative note a moment ago, and so I want to really start this by saying that yes, I think that's true. I think that certainly resonates with what I've been seeing and with all of the colleagues that I've been consulting with, what they have been seeing. But I also think we're seeing a lot more proactiveness in terms of help seeking, and students actually really do, you know, I think one thing that has been true about the pandemic as a whole is that we're talking about mental health a lot more. We're seeing it in national news, you know, as a topic. It's something that, you know, the students are really aware of, that this is something that we're talking about really openly in a way that maybe hadn't happened as much before. And so while there are greater probably numbers of concerns and number of, you know, mental health concerns presenting, I feel like the students are being more proactive about recognizing and seeking help for those concerns versus kind of waiting till it escalates to a situation that feels like a crisis. And that's been really positive and really encouraging, I think, for, you know, us as counselors to see that, you know, students are, you know, wanting to be able to address these things and talk about it maybe in a way that they maybe would not have felt comfortable doing so before.
One of the things that's interesting on our intake form, we do have a question after students scroll down and check some of the things that they're experiencing. The question is about COVID-19 and is it having an impact on your mental health? And one of the things that I'm seeing on our intake forms is that many students are saying no. And that's very interesting because in reality, what we find out as we're sitting with them students is it's a yes. And I put that into the conversation. I don't know why they're checking no. I haven't really figured that one out, but they're checking no. But in our time with them, we're finding out that it is indeed for many of them, it is the pandemic. And so for us, what we're seeing, the question is yes, there's an uptick. And what we're seeing is students who wouldn't normally come to the counseling center are coming. And in part, that's for several different reasons, right? One is, as Matthew said, they can't get outside and do some of the things that they used to do before that serve to help them be mentally well and mentally balanced. So, you know, the opportunities to interact with their peers, they're getting outside, even exercising less or running less or walking less. And so those things are impacting their mental health. And so they're coming to the counseling center. When we first made the switch and students start to see us virtually, some of my counselors were concerned because what appeared for some of the students is what they were presenting with was not necessarily a mental health issue. And so they're saying, what are we doing? Should I be seeing this student? And my answer to that is absolutely. Because yes, it looks different, but is it a mental health, a mental wellness issue? It is. Because, you know, what can start off as a small thing and maybe not too much of a challenge or a barrier could become a larger thing if they have no one on a professional basis to talk to. It could become something that does become a huge issue for them. But having us to talk to, having a counselor to talk to, a professional to talk to, could help them maintain and keep the balance that keeps them mentally well or keeps them in a better state. So I think that we have seen more students coming who don't present with the more serious issues. But I think that's a good thing because they're coming out of something's not right. There's a dissonance here. There's something a little off with me. I do recognize that my lack of interaction and activity and the social things that happen on campus, I'm missing those things and I'm grieving that loss. All the things that I could have done, you know, we're getting ready to graduate, you know, our seniors, and they usually have 100 days of events, small and large, to lead up to none of those things are happening. So those students are grieving loss in many, many ways. And so is it a diagnosable issue? Is it in the DSM? Maybe not. But I think that on the other side, what we're doing is preventative care. And that right now is as important as anything else we do to keep the students who are and have a sense of balance, who are in a mentally healthy place, to keep them there, to help them stay there, to support them as they try to figure out ways to stay in that place. I think that's one of the most important things that we can be doing right now. So we welcome those students as a counseling center. We welcome our doors are open, our virtual doors are open. to those students for them to come in and meet with a counselor.
That was great, Georgette. Thank you. The next question, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has shared data that 1 in 4 young adults has struggled with suicidal ideation within the last 30 days. This is an increase from 10% in 2018 to 25% in 2020. Given this, it is clearly important for higher education institutions to provide suicide awareness and prevention education to faculty, staff, and students. How do we accomplish this in our current environment with physical and social distancing, remote learning, and working?
There's a lot of different ways you can do this. I mean, I think it's, you know, there are platforms. In fact, I know at Jefferson, one of the things we are doing a lot more of now than we have historically done, even though we did do it before, is we have a lot of what's called like gatekeeper type trainings, which is things like QPR and mental health first aid. We're running more classes in those areas right now than we have ever done before, because faculty and staff want to get training in those areas. They want to be more aware of who they should be concerned about when it comes to students' needs. I mean, we have to remember that there's always this fine line on college campuses between, you know, if you think about your faculty, many of them are there, depending on what kind of institution you are. You know, some institutions are not designed for faculty necessarily to come in. They teach because it's a part of what they do. They're there because of something else, whether it be research or some other aspects of things that they're doing. The teaching becomes a part of it, but there's always they tend to be invested enough in their students so they can see when something's not going well, and they want to know those kinds of things. So these trainings do exist virtually now. QPR, for example, which is called Question, Persuade, and Refer, is a training that typically is hour and a half or so, can be done virtually now. It used to be something we'd always do in person, and we would do it in person. We'd get 20 or 30 people to show up each time and kind of run these sessions, and now we're doing them online, and we're getting just as many people. Then we get students that pop in on those sessions because they want to be aware of how to look out for their peers and stuff in the context of all this stuff too. And so there's definitely avenues to do this. I think the other thing that is so vitally important for college campuses right now to be thinking about is, making sure that all the resources off campus, if you will, that can support students are readily available to them, that they're aware of the hotline numbers that exist, they're aware of the crisis text line, they're aware of all these various resources that can be out there for them, and that we have easy to access locations for all of that type of information. So it's not like it's buried on a counseling center page somewhere where a student really has to be looking for the counseling center to find that resource. Like, it's somewhere where they have access to it and they see it, and they can do that. So there's definitely ways to do this now, even in the midst of a pandemic. It's a little bit outside the box, and again, it creates this, we're sort of talking Zoom fatigue and stuff like that. I mean, it's, do you want to sit there for another hour and a half? And I do think that our faculty and staff and other students, for that matter, are interested in learning enough about this so that they care about their friends, they care about the students, they want to be able to be helpful in some way. So there are definitely resources out there that can be done during this time.
I agree with Matt. We have provided QPR training on Newman's campus to students, faculty, coaches, because we are a Franciscan University. We have chaplains. Even the chaplains have been trained in QPR. Our Res Life staff, both the student staff and the professional staff, I think to date we've trained about 88 people. And so we've done that and are able to continue, or planning on continuing to do that virtually, so that we have our staff is trained that way. Our internal web page has all kinds of resources that, as Matt pointed out, all kinds of hotlines, and the numbers for those things are on our internal web page that students can access very, very easily. We also have New Care, and it is an online platform where students can both talk to medical professionals using their computer and online, and they can also, we have the Talk Now feature that's available to them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so they can call in at any point and talk to a counselor through the Talk Now feature of New Care. So there are ways to provide for students, and we're continuing to attempt to provide them. The other thing we have is we've developed a Wellness Wednesday radio show. And every Wednesday from 12 to 1, one of our counselor moderates a conversation on a topic of well-being, mental health. And so we've had professionals and those who are in the field come in and talk about suicide. And so students and faculty and administrators can access that radio show both from 12 to 1 at Wednesdays, but then it's turned into a podcast, so they have access to it anytime that they want to listen to it. And so educating faculty, administrators, and our campus on those things. And I will also say that our faculty administrators seem to feel very comfortable reaching out to us, to me, by email. If they're concerned about a student, they will reach out very readily and say, Georgette, I'm concerned about this student. I know you can't talk to me about them, but here's what happened in class. Or let me send you what they wrote and why I'm concerned. And I know you'll follow up, or the counseling center will follow up. But they feel very comfortable reaching out to us and saying, I do have a concern for the student in my class. They have changed, or they're not even showing up for class anymore. We also have a care team. And our care team right now is meeting weekly. As we get into the semester, we meet every other week, but I'm present at the care team meetings to hear the names of students who are struggling, so that we become aware at the counseling center, even if they're not coming, if they do come. Or if I hear the name from a faculty member or someone who's concerned, I already have that name in my head because I've heard through care team that this student is struggling. And names are shared there of students who have things like food insecurity, housing insecurity, academic issues, grief and loss, and mental health issues. I'm not allowed to give any information, of course, but I can listen, take it in, and then go back to my team and say, this is what we should be on the lookout for. So there are ways to do it.
Yeah, I think a lot of really good points have already been brought up. So I'll try to maybe just kind of expand on a few or add a few things here and there. I know QPR has been, mentioned by both of you, and I think that's a wonderful program, and mental health first aid. And one thing that's might be true about mental health first aid is because there's sometimes some federal funding available, that might be something where a trainer can come in and offer that, and that's at no cost, to the institution. So there is some benefit there. And then a model that I've actually started using and really enjoying is VAR, which is through Active Minds. It's validate, appreciate, and refer. And it's not as specific to suicide prevention as QPR and mental health first aid, but I like it because it then is a little bit more widely accessible to the students as a way to just start those hard conversations. So maybe they're just worried about a student that is showing signs of pretty severe depression. And so again, they might not be sure if there are suicidal thoughts happening or not, but it's a model that I think is really approachable to the students to be able to start those conversations. And then we can also provide some of that additional training about how do you really directly ask somebody about suicide and be able to, have that conversation as part of that. So again, that's through Active Minds. It's called VAR. As Matt mentioned, we put the crisis lines everywhere, everywhere we possibly can, on the website, in brochures, on my email signature, on social media. I think it's helpful to think about, if it's through social media, is it through the institution's kind of main pages, right? Is that something that's sort of being established as part of the campus, culture, this, openness to talking about suicide and suicide prevention versus just like the counseling center pages, right? Like really being thoughtful about that. I think can be helpful. And then, we also have a care team, and we've established a form that FACSO, as you were talking about, Georgette, a way for faculty and staff and coaches and such to be able, or even other students to be able to report if they have concerns about a student. And what's nice about that form is they can do it anonymously if they choose. So it can sometimes be a little bit harder, to get some information that way. But overall, even if someone is reporting anonymously, they're able to provide enough information that, the care team is able to think about some interventions or check in with the student. And so having a really easily accessible way for folks to be able to report concerns, I think can be helpful. And then just a couple individual programs we've done, because again, I think we've been challenged by how do we do some of these things when we have to maintain social distancing and all of these things. So a couple programs that we really had some success with. We did a a bulletin board, A Million Reasons to Stay. That's a campaign that some campuses have been doing across the country, where students will write positive affirmations for their fellow students, messages of hope, reasons, to stay alive. And you post those on a bulletin board with suicide prevention information that students can take away. So like the suicide prevention wallet cards and such. And then we also were able to do a really successful program around Shine a Light of Hope. So giving students or inviting students, faculty, and staff to, place an electronic candle in their window on National Suicide Prevention Day. And so those are some programs that, we were trying to think about, how do we still engage people in this conversation and have it feel hopeful to them. And again, really focusing on the help seeking and the hopeful messaging that we can do.
Thank you. I'm frantically taking notes over here because these resources are so great. Some of our resources are being listed in our chat too. So if as you're mentioning them, we're putting up the links to those resources. So thank you. I have a lot of tabs open right now. Okay, we're going to switch gears a little bit. The JED Foundation survey also found 61% of students are feeling extremely or very concerned about racial unrest in this country, and at least 34% of students are concerned about the direct effects of racial unrest in their own communities. Can you discuss the impact of racial stress or race-based trauma on higher education communities, particularly how this affects Black, Indigenous people of color, students, faculty, and administrators? What are strategies for addressing the mental health impacts of racial stress in higher education?
Well, the impact is great. I think a couple things come to mind. There were already things that were going on in our country in terms of racial injustice. This isn't new, but I think it's another layer for Black students, students of color, Indigenous students. It's another layer added to a time of pandemic. And because of technology, we have more access to seeing the videos and, actually hearing the voices. And so the impact on our students is great. This last spring, in the midst of the beginning of us being, isolated, shut down, we had a peaceful protest on campus where students did come wearing their masks, keeping social distance, but it was out of the racial injustices that they were feeling the weight of. And so one of the ways a group of students wanted to deal with that is to gather on the campus, keeping social distance, but to lift up the names of those people who died and in various ways at the hands of police and others. And so they had a peaceful protest, and then they walked to the curb and he had signs with the names of the people on it, and they stood at the street. And I remember very vividly watching, because I was there, and they stood at the street and cars passed and they held up those signs. And there was a palpable feeling, heavy feeling there. I could feel it. I think that others probably could around the campus, around the area where students were standing. And so many of the students who I have talked to, administrators, also faculty, have voiced the sadness, the frustration, sometimes the anger in various ways. And Newman had just begun to start to form a committee for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the midst of this. And things got, revved up because we're in the pandemic, and it seemed like more things were happening. And so that institutionally has been happening, and they've been meeting, and they've had listening sessions and all those things. The other thing I think that higher education can do is provide platforms for students to talk with each other, to share their experiences, to learn from each other, and especially a safe, supportive platform for those students who are parts of those populations. Indigenous students, students of color, Black students need a place where they can feel safe to talk about their pain, their hurt, their anger, their frustration. And so being on a PWI campus, that is not readily available. That is not happening because at a PWI, frankly, higher education, student affairs, administrators have a luxury, a privilege, if I can say that, to not think about it. And because it's not as apparent to them, those students are mixed in, they seem to be fine, they seem to be okay, we'll keep doing what we're doing. At a HBCU, it's maybe more apparent, those groups do exist inherently, but we don't have that at the PWI. So I think it's important for us in higher education to recognize we need to create those spaces for those students where they can talk not only with others who don't look like them and learn from them, but with each other, where they can feel supported, where they can talk about their frustrations and their anger and not be judged. And not be looked at like, oh, here you go again. So one of the things that we've been able to provide out of the counseling center are those groups. And so a new group on Newman's campus emerging out of this, and the recognition that we have a BSU, we have Black Student Union Group. And then there are Black males on campus who have started, they call it Brothers Take Action. And that's groups that are student-led and student-started. And then out of the counseling center, we have now started a group called the Brown Sugar Sisters. And that is in recognition, like BTA, but Brothers Take Action, have a space. But where do these women go that need to talk about their pain, the pain that they've experienced both on campus and in the community, and how do we help them use their voices? Because many times these students don't feel as if they can, as though they can go and talk about what's happening to them or what has happened to them even on the campus, because they think nothing will happen, nothing will come out of it, or somehow they'll be penalized because they stepped forward. So part of forming this group is helping these women find their voices and take leadership positions and roles and speak up and have also a safe, supported space to share, where they're not judged, where it's not frowned upon, where they don't have to worry about anybody retaliating. So we've been able to create that space. So my point is that I think universities and colleges, especially PWIs, need to be very intentional about providing opportunities for students to share, talk, and they need to listen. And students and faculty and administrators who are in those groups need to see action. Talk is wonderful, but they need to see action. And so those things are important in higher education for us to take notice of, and be very intentional, because on top of all the weight that everybody else is carrying because of where we are as a nation and as a world with a pandemic, understanding that Black people are carrying a whole nother weight that it could cause them to break. And what do we want to do about that as a university? How can we help as educators? So that's my thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think that stuff is it's such an incredibly important thing. And as you're saying, Georgette, these are issues that have been going on for a long time, and it is such a travesty that it took this summer for suddenly some people to wake up and realize that this is a problem. I also think about it sort of from a modeling perspective too. I mean, I'm an employee at a medical school, and for those of you in the Delaware Valley that know much about any of the medical schools in the area, historically we have struggled with Black students, having Black students even apply. Forget about Black students being on campus; they got to apply first. And that's been a real challenge. And when you think about things from a medical school model, there's always this hierarchy, right? You got the students, and then there's second-year students, and then you got the residents, all the way up to the attending faculty. This has to be addressed at a much higher level. And so we're thinking, on Jefferson, we've started what they're calling brave conversations through our diversity, equity, and inclusion office, and going into departments and having conversations about how do we think about race and how do we think about inclusivity issues at that level. Because if we expect our students to feel comfortable and safe having these conversations and talking about the things that matter to them, well, we have to be able to model an environment for them in which that's possible. And so, kind of doing things sort of from that perspective and thinking about it, not just how can we support the students, that's absolutely part of the agenda, but how can we do that by also making sure that they are reflective in the people that are there educating them and working with them and being a part of their own college experience. I think that's a huge part of something that we've been thinking a lot about. And then another thing that's happening, certainly at Jefferson, I know we're not the only ones by any stretch, is this concept of allyship, and how can individuals who cannot fully appreciate the experience of the BIPOC community to ally, and how can I be helpful and supportive in some way and appreciate someone else's experience and be more open to that, and partnering around some of those kinds of things. Our medical students this summer really got activated, and what happened was they sent a list of, I forget how many, I think there was 10 demands to leadership at the university to say, we want some changes, and here are the things that we want changes. I don't have the list directly in front of me, but it was everything from thinking about tuition costs and thinking about issues that are going on campus that actually promote white communities for applying to these kinds of things, whereas it's exclusive in some ways. And so they're trying to fix those kinds of things all the way down to, we need to hire more faculty members of color. Like, that's an incredibly important piece to this model. And so the students got really activated on this kind of stuff, and we're doing that. And then within the higher education group, something that we're still pushing this forward, although it's hard to get some college campuses to do it because it's a big ask these days. We said, listen, this conversation that became national at the level in which it did over the summer, how do we carry that conversation forward so it doesn't stop? You know, I think the fear that I have is any of these conversations around social justice, what happens is people get activated for a period of time, and then things sort of settle down, and everyone just, I don't want to say forgets about it, that's not the fair way of saying it, but it sort of gets pushed by the wayside a little bit, and it takes something else to bring it back up. And we don't want that to happen. We want college students to feel like they have the ability to share and to talk about it and continue those conversations, because things don't happen when we talk and then stop. And then a couple years later, we talk and then we stop. And so we were working on a project that was intended to be within campuses, but also have the ability to expand across campuses, which was, bringing leadership at campuses together to invite students to come in to have a conversation about what issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion would you like to see changed on your campus, and having them in a safe space without bias from others, be able to just throw all these ideas out onto a PowerPoint slide and kind of like put all these things out there, and then together as a diverse group of students on the campus, think about what are the priorities for that campus in terms of how they would like to see things move forward. And then our task was to work with folks within the higher ed group to say, all right, students have said these are the top 10 issues across multiple campuses that they would like to see changed. We all know that students have wonderful ideas, but we also know that sometimes their ideas are met with pretty significant challenges. They might have an idea that's going to cost $10 million to fix. And we look at that and go, that's a fantastic idea, but I don't know how I can make that happen. So how can we then take those 10 ideas, for example, that they come up with and say, how do we support students to have meaningful conversations about those things with the right people on your campus so that they can hear what you're trying to say the way in which you want it to be heard so things can happen? Because too often students have ideas, but they have no idea who to talk to make anything happen. And so they just become ideas that live out there. We want them to feel like they can take action in those areas. And so supporting students doing that. So we're still in the process of doing that with some college campuses and working with them with a what's called a nominal group approach to kind of collect the data in a way, again, an unbiased way of collecting the data, but organizing it in such a way that it really takes a look at within a college campus, but then also across college campuses. What are these issues that students see as the most important things for them to change on their campus? And how can we then help support them in taking action in those kinds of areas? And so we're still in the infancy process of that. It was tough to push that out in the fall because college campuses were coming back trying to figure out how to do everything virtually and a whole host of other things that were going on. So it's really a spring project for us, but that's something that we're focused on as well.
Yeah, I really don't have a whole lot to add. I think that, this is an area where, as professionals, I want to be, listening more than talking, right? Taking in as much information as possible. So that, again, really be focused on the action steps, right? Exactly what needs to happen next? How can we actually take action? Georgette, I, as a professional, feel very inspired by the groups that you have, started or we're talking about on your campus. I think that is fantastic and something that I've been, thinking about ways that we might be able to do something, here. And I feel really inspired by that. And, we'll look forward to talking to you more about that. I think in particular, in my role at the college, I've also been thinking about, again, equity and access in terms of these wellness services, right? For our Black students or students of color who historically there have been barriers and stigma and all of these things that have been challenges for our students to be accessing wellness services. So I want to be part of these bigger conversations, but I'm also really thinking about that's where maybe I can sort of take some action steps, is thinking about how do I provide services, or how does the college provide wellness services in a way that there's truly equity in terms of access and being able to break down some of those barriers. So, having those conversations with students, and at the same time, though, not holding the students responsible for my cultural competency, right? As professionals, we have an ethical responsibility to be culturally competent in this way. And while I want very much to listen to the students and have the students be able to have really open conversations with me about their needs and those kinds of things, I also just think it's important for us to remember that we are responsible for being, culturally competent in all of these ways and being able to think through these things in a really informed way.
I'd like to say one more thing, Allison. Margaret, you made me think about it. The role of those of us who are working on campuses and who are Black or Indigenous or people of color, it does become a role of, I'm counselor, I'm director of counseling, I'm role model, significantly role model. I am a face that students see that make them more comfortable on campus and coming to the counseling center. So to Matt's point, the how we hire, who we hire is important. Cultural competency is very important, but students feel more welcome, more sort of at home when they see people who look like them, and especially in positions like, an assistant dean or a director of counseling. It says something to them about the university. And so being kind of intentional in that area for the college and university. In the Brown Sugars group meeting last week, one of the students said, I walked into class last year and I had a Black female student, and she said, I almost fell over. I couldn't believe it. And I felt so good about it. She said, it really made me feel good about being at Newman and being in that particular class. That I had never had that experience before. And I think we have to be conscious of the fact our students should not, be able to say, I've never had that experience before at our universities. So I think that's the other piece of it. And, I say sometimes, young people can't be what they don't see. And so our students need to see in some way, shape, or form those who reflect where they want to go, and receive those people into as mentors, to tell them, to help them understand and see what is possible, and to give them hope. So I think that's very important for colleges and universities to be very intentional about, opening the door, because there are capable people out there finding ways to make, to help people who are capable, and people of color and Indigenous and Black come and apply for those jobs, those positions, and then being intentional about knowing that the needs of the student are also represented in the people that you hire to work with the students.
Thank you. We're going to switch gears a little bit. We have a lot to cover here. Many of us have seen numerous articles warning of burnout among employees in higher education. We are feeling the demands of balancing remote work with illness, grief, and loss, concerns about racial and social injustice, and family and home stressors. What advice do you give to your colleagues about self-care in 2021?
The Nike slogan, just do it. It is such an important topic that, when the pandemic first started, the HESPC was meeting kind of monthly, and we have a sort of a monthly topic around student wellness or student suicide prevention that we think about, and we would do that on a monthly basis. This pandemic hit, and I shouldn't say everyone, but many people reached out and said, can we meet more frequently? We started meeting weekly. And while the first couple of meetings were really the practical stuff that I think Georgette was kind of alluding to earlier in the presentation today, around licensure issues, can we even see these students, and how in the world do we do it? It quickly transformed once we figured out answers to those questions and moved forward. It quickly transformed into how do we take care of ourselves in the midst of doing all this kind of work? Because, you know, what time does the day end when you're doing telehealth services? And oh, by the way, now you can do telehealth. And like traditionally what happens on most college campuses is that the counseling centers, you know, really kind of slow down in the summertime. There's a lot less students on campus. You know, they might still be open seeing the students that are there, whether it be graduate students or what have you, but there's a lot less demand during that time. The problem is we've already figured out a model this last spring on how to see our students when they're not on our college campus. So when does that stop? Like normally they would go home and like their old counselors that they would see in high school or whatever, they'd pick them up for the summer and then they'd come back to us in the fall. And now what's happening is, well, we could see them all summer long. And what does that do for the person who usually spent their summer planning for programming for the next year, doing some vacation time, like, you know, all of that kind of stuff that we usually spent that time to kind of re-energize, get refocused, to you know, the self-care piece was such a big part of all of that. Now we're seeing students all summer long. We see students at 7 o'clock at night. We've like all kinds of junk was going on, which is so different than before. So the content or the topics that we were talking about on these weekly groups went from the practical stuff to what in the world are you doing to take care of yourself? Because it is so important that we spend that time thinking about it. And I always go back to the, you know, sort of the metaphor that, or the analogy that I had a supervisor in graduate school tell me this, and I've heard multiple people say it since then. So this is not a new thought by any stretch, but you know, it's that whole concept of when we get on airplanes and you're traveling with a, you know, a young child or something like that, if the oxygen masks are deployed, who do you stick the mask on first? Well, you're supposed to stick it on yourself first, because that young person that you just helped isn't going to be able to help you. You need to help yourself and then you can help them. And it is such a wonderful way of thinking about a metaphor for life in terms of just taking care of other people. We can't do it if we can't take care of ourselves. And so reminding people that to be the best at what it is that we are trying to accomplish, we need to take care of ourselves first. It's such a critical piece of all of this kind of stuff. And so, you know, while there are a million different things that people can do, you know, self-care is really about, I think, finding the time to do something and then figuring out what works for you. And it could be simple little things. Like I remember, you know, Margaret, you probably remember some of those earlier meetings. There were people who would turn their camera off in the middle of the meeting, but they'd come back on to have comments from time to time. What were they doing? They were standing up and walking around in the room during the meeting, stretching, you know, taking care of themselves, having lunch in the middle of a meeting. We didn't used to do that before, but now we do it all the time. Like, self-care just has become a piece that, you know, if you think about it, like, when do I do it? You can find any time to do these kinds of things. Self-care is the person that starts the meeting at 5 minutes after the hour instead of on the hour. I'm trying to work it the other way around, where it's like, you know, we stop at 10 of or 5 of, so you can get up and walk around or go to the bathroom, because all these meetings go back to back to back to back to back, and there's no time for that stuff. But also having boundaries for yourself and saying, listen, I don't need to see a student at 8 o'clock at night. It is not an emergency. This is not a crisis. I don't need to handle this at 8 o'clock at night. We can find another time that we can do this, because at 8 o'clock at night, I need to do stuff with my family, or I need to do stuff for myself, whatever it might be. So while there's probably 1,000 different options out there, the simple answer, I think, to the question, in my opinion, really goes back to the Nike slogan of just do it. Like, you need to just do it.
Agree with what Matt said. Just do it. Find the things, and sometimes it's going back to the things that we knew were helpful to us, and for whatever reason we stopped. Like, listening to music is very helpful. So if I'm not in a meeting, which I am a lot, with not meeting with a student, and I'm doing things administrative on my computer, then I have music playing in the background. Sometimes I'll get in a meeting, forget it's on, and they'll say, nice music, Georgette, but I'll let it play for a little bit. So I think it's important to do it. The other thing I would say is call your counselor. Set up an appointment for yourself. Have someone, if it's not a counselor, but you don't want to put it on a friend. You don't want to put this on a family member. I think it's very, very important for counselors, for mental health professionals, to remember the advice that, you know, they give to their students and others that they see. See a counselor. See a counselor. please. And the other thing, the third thing that I'm going to say is, people say we're working at home. No, we're at home working. And what does that mean? What that means is everything that happens at home when you're not at home and you drive to the campus and you're in your office, now you're home. And guess what? Those things are happening and you're there. You used to be able to get up in the morning, get dressed and drive away from it and then come back to it at 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening. Well, now guess what? You're in it all day long. And so you are at home. So there may be something occurring, God forbid, a pipe burst or something like that, and somebody else deal with it. Well, guess who's home now to deal with it, or at least be directly impacted by it? So I think we need to stop saying that we're working at home. No, we're at home working. So all of the things that happen can happen while we're trying to work. The other day I was in a meeting with the dean, and she has dogs, and I have a dog. And my dog heard her dog start barking. And this isn't, so what happened. So now there are 3 dogs and they're barking. She's apologizing. So I think the other thing we have to do is give each other permission to be at home. Things are going to happen. So if the dogs start barking, or if your son walks in and asks you, can they have a snack, to be able to smile, to make it okay for your colleague to be working at home or at home working. I think that's the other thing, is to give that permission and take a snow day. I think about that because when it snows, I don't have to go to campus, so a student can still meet with me. It doesn't matter if it's 6 inches of snow outside. Take a snow day for yourself. And one of the things that my counselor actually suggested to me is set an alarm. Set an alarm for when you start work and when you stop. And when the alarm goes off to stop, put it away. Today, at whatever time you finish your day, shut your work computer off and put it out of sight and give yourself a weekend. So those are my suggestions. And really, that's what I try to do for myself as self-care.
Yeah, I think putting language to this is really helpful. So Matt, I love the airplane language, right? Yeah, help, attach the mask to someone else before you attach your own. The Nike slogan, just do it. I'll use the expression a lot. You can't pour from an empty cup, right? This idea. And then I'll use this analogy too, that I think sometimes can be helpful, of a well of water, right? So if you think of sort of your emotional and mental energy as a well, how full is your well today? I wanted my well to be really full to be able to speak to you all. So I actually was intentional about eating a really nutritious breakfast this morning, right? Where on another morning might have been like, I don't know, do I need breakfast today? So to think about, the fact that there are activities that are going to kind of, fill our well in terms of our energy, and that are also going to drain our well, and that it's not necessarily activities that we enjoy or don't enjoy, right? So I truly, truly love and enjoy the work that I do with students, the clinical work, but there is a draining component to that, right? There is a lot of mental and emotional energy that we're expending just, all day. And so how are we really intentional about thinking about where our well is at any given moment, and being thoughtful about how we refill our well in terms of our energy, and knowing how important that is to the work that we do, and being able to actually then support others. And then real quick, I'll just share too, because this has been really meaningful for me. I don't know if it will be for you, but I had a colleague that I was talking to about this real early on in the pandemic. And it was, we were kind of in crisis mode a little bit more at that point. And she shared with me that the Greek root for the word crisis is actually to separate or to sift. This idea that crisis, or being in some sort of state of crisis, actually in some ways kind of makes it a necessity to sort through or separate or sift out, right? The things that are priorities, the things that are important to us. So, are we giving ourselves permission to do that, to be able to focus on the things that it really feels important for us to focus on professionally, so that we can do good work, but also be really able to take care of ourselves, knowing that that's, kind of equally important right now.
Well, it lets us be human, right? All this, the dogs barking and stuff like that. It reminds us that we are human, and to some degree, our colleagues, our students, everybody sees us for what it is. It's like, I'm sitting in a kitchen. Guess what? It's like this is what our life is actually like, And from a counseling side of it, that is so counter to like the training that most of us went through, which is this idea of like, we're supposed to some degree to be the blank slate where they can project their thoughts and feelings and concerns and worries and fantasies and all this stuff into this room where we are. And here we now have a room where it's like, yeah, there could be a kid that can walk behind you. And yes, the dog's going to get in the way and all this other kind of stuff. And I think students appreciate that. You know, because it's not the way we typically are. Like, there's no pictures of my family in my office, you know, and there's no pictures in family in my back, you know, like where I'm sitting usually. But every once in a while, I have to, like, you know, hit the mute button and turn to the side and clearly talk to somebody very quickly and then move things on, you know. So I think, anyway, it's just all those kinds of human elements that are just so, they're refreshing if we allow them to be refreshing. If we get anxious by them, then we're missing the point, I think.
These tips are so great. One of my favorite parts of the pandemic is my colleague recently had a baby. So the baby gets to show up on all of our Zoom meetings, and I'm best friends with baby Devin now. And, you know, my goal is to make her smile during all of our meetings. So, you know, it's really comforting to see the life, you know, like you said, the animals and the babies and the kids, and realize that they're human. But your self-care tips are great, not just for those in counseling. So I appreciate it. I took a lot of that to heart. I don't shut down very much. And I like, Georgette, your timer for shutting down work. I'll try. I promise I'll try. Okay, so we have one more planned question, and then we'll see if we have any questions from our Q&A. In all the adaptations of the delivery of counseling and mental health services, what practices stand out to you as those that will have a lasting effect in 2021 and beyond? Has the use of telehealth done anything to address or reduce stigma around seeking mental health services? What recommendations do you have for the future for treating youth mental health issues? That's a good number of questions there. So if you need me to repeat anything, let me know.
Many of them we've already answered, I think, to some degree, right? I mean, you know, I don't think telehealth is going away. You know, the only avenue where I can see telehealth struggling at all would be if you happen to be on a college campus where the funding support for the counseling center is not through student fees or something like that, where somehow you're utilizing insurance. You know, if the insurance companies decide to stop reimbursing for telehealth at the rate that they've been reimbursing for it, I can see that changing that a little bit. But for the most part, that's not how most college campuses are funded to do the work that they're doing. So, you know, I definitely think that the telehealth piece is there. And I think it's going to be I suspect at some point in time, we're going to get some guidance from, you know, some of the leadership across the country on college counseling and thinking a little bit about how do we want to utilize telehealth and when do we not want to utilize telehealth, even though I suspect it will still be an individual basis. But I think there's so many wonderful avenues to do that. I think that the outreach programming, you know, I could see a blended approach of those kinds of things where historically we've done things on campuses where students come in and do that. And I remember back when we started the higher ed group like 5 or 6 years ago, we had conversations with community colleges, you know, and community colleges really struggled with outreach stuff because they'd have all these things planned on campus, but the students didn't live there. They usually showed up for class and turned around, went home and went to work or did their life or whatever it was. You know, and now with these virtual platforms for doing things, I think you're going to see, I suspect, a blended model of that too. I know the students love to be around each other. Most of them are dying to be around each other right now. You know, but I think there's going to be opportunities to think about, are there virtual platforms for some things like that moving forward that make it more accessible to more people? But those are clearly the things that I see as we move forward, that I think those two things live on. How, I'm not entirely sure, but I'm sure they'll be there in some capacity.
I think, and I think Margaret alluded to this earlier, I think one of the things in terms of recommendations that we have for the future, I think first of all, we have to begin to think about the future and the impact that this is having on not just the current college student, but those who are coming. we're going to see the impact of this pandemic for years and years and years to come. For the children that are in elementary school now will come in having lived through this thing and experienced this thing, and it's changed the way they see the world, the way they see their community, the way they see themselves. So I think we have to be very, very intentional about beginning to understand that we're going to be treating the effects of this pandemic for years and years to come. We're going to be addressing these issues for years and years to come. And so we need to be forward thinking in terms of what is the next thing. We're going to have to do our own studying and researching and coming up with ways to treat young people, adolescents, early young adults who have gone through a pandemic. This, for some students, is definitely a trauma, perhaps a little T, but for some of them, it's a big T. And they are the students that are currently in our universities and colleges, and they're coming. And so if we don't address how we're going to educate them, how we're going to provide programming for them, how we're going to counsel them, then we're going to lose at the end of the day. And so, and our students will miss out because we haven't given intentional thought to that. So I think it's very important for us now to begin to think about the things that need to be in place in terms of treating youth and young adults in mental health areas who have gone through a trauma. This has not happened in our country for many, 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 many years. And most of the people that have experienced it before are dead and gone. Well, now look, we have a whole new generation that is coming forward to come to college, and they're going to be carrying this baggage, which includes the grief and loss of events in their lives, graduations and proms and all those things, the grief and loss of parents and grandparents, and and having gotten used to being isolated and by themselves because they did some of their classes virtually. So how do I connect? I'm not sure I even know how to connect with other people anymore, and I'm going to be on this college campus. We've got to start to address those things, and I think when we're addressing those things, then we're thinking of how to treat youth with mental health issues.
Yeah, I think two really important things that we can continue to think about that we've maybe been thinking more about through this experience is, first of all, how do we create a whole campus culture of wellness, right? It can't just be the counseling center, which is, why also I really appreciate this opportunity, for us to be speaking about this topic today and with you all, because this is, something that our students really want to see campus-wide. They want to feel supported in the classroom. They want to feel supported by their coach and by their teammates and their peers and in all of these different spaces. And so how do we work together with all of the offices on our campus to really be thinking about the messages that we're actually giving around mental health and wellness and creating that campus culture that really says, we want you to be healthy in this way, and this is how we want to support you in this way. So again, some of the things we've already talked about, right? The training programs we can do, the ways we can include folks in, being able to express concerns about students, care teams, et cetera. And then reducing stigma, right? So those two really kind of go together. But I think, again, I've been really pleased to see how much more we're talking about mental health now. And I wish it wasn't under these circumstances, but this is really at the forefront of people's minds in a way that I'm not sure it was, a couple of years ago. So to be able to really continue that conversation and be able to, make sure that we're still doing things very proactively and intentionally on our campuses that are about reducing stigma, making sure we're talking about this. So like Georgette was just talking about, when we have these future students coming in that have, that are used to talking about it in this way, that we're continuing that culture for them and that understanding that, yes, this is something that we talk about and that we support, as a campus community, and not just on this individual level or just through the counseling office and these individual counseling sessions that typically are very private and confidential and,
Can I put a quick plug in for a group of people that are on all of our college campuses that are totally relevant for what both of you guys are talking about here, which is thinking about future students. Our admissions offices right now and over the last month or two have been doing the work of filtering through that trauma in a way that they're probably reading stuff that they never had to read before. They're making decisions based on data points that they never had to consider in the past. Even next year's group coming through, they're going to have to make decisions on, you've got students that were straight A students and suddenly have been sent home for the last year in a virtual platform whose A's have turned into C's, but would be outstanding candidates on excellent institutions. And how do you figure that, and comparing that student to somebody who's been in person that entire time, and the narratives that go along with these like they are the ones sifting through that first layer of this trauma that Georgette was referring to in terms of bringing these students on our campus. And they're reading stuff now that they probably are just, I mean, I'm sure I shouldn't say they've read many things, those that have been doing this for a while, but they're reading things right now that are probably very different than what they're used to reading. And so I would offer a virtual hug to all of our admissions folks these days, because their work right now, I think, is probably far more complicated and challenging than it has ever been before.
Yeah, that's a great point, Matthew. I totally agree with you. Excuse me. We have 2 questions in our side chat here. Let me. With Zoom fatigue amongst students, what recommendations do you have for online wellness programming, and how best to engage students in the online platform or increase community connection?
I think it's important to be able to offer both asynchronous options and synchronous options, right? So making sure that you're giving some students agency around that. Do they have the ability to engage with a group in real time if they want that, or do they have, do they want to kind of take more of a spectator role in that way? But if you're doing a real-time online program, I think it's interesting. I forget what study it was, but they talked about sort of attention span and the ability of folks to hold attention. And in a classroom setting, when you're in person, in general, 20 minutes, right? Like if you have one continuous activity that's kind of 20 minutes long, people can have their attention engaged. I don't have research to back this up, but I've had some conversations with colleagues, and we've all agreed that in a Zoom platform, we're talking more about 5 to 7 minutes, right? In terms of like, you got to kind of switch things up a lot more frequently to be able to hold the engagement in that way. So I think the more, if this is sort of a way that we do have to engage with people right now, I think we can do it, but we really might have to think outside the box of, new ways that we've done, in terms of doing outreach and teaching programming, where we're switching up activities and doing things that create interactions with people every few minutes versus kind of, having these longer periods of time. So I'm a big fan of the Zoom breakout rooms. And I think that, you can't use those enough really in terms of giving people opportunities to really have these sort of smaller group conversations, things like that. That's a great way, I think, to engage folks in programs. Again, just giving them some options, though, different options to do things through. Do you do a newsletter that people can just read through, where you have some interactive activities they can click on and do on their own, in addition to the real-time stuff? Because people may just need to be able to take things in small doses, 10 minutes at a time, 15 minutes at a time. So if you're giving them these activities that they can do asynchronously too, I think that can be helpful.
One of the things, the weather will be nice soon, no matter where we are. It doesn't look like it out my window right now, right, Allison? But one of the things we were able to do last spring is one of our counselors went on campus, and she is a certified yoga instructor, and she actually invited students to bring their masks and their mats and social distance and do yoga. When we did it, when we were on campus, we might have 6 students show up. She had 25 students show up on the front lawn of the gym, where there's enough room for them to social distance and actually do yoga. Students, and we provided some mats. Students who didn't have mats or had never done yoga showed up. So being able to recognize that those things are available for students, so that, they're not on the screen, they're actually with each other, but they're taking all the precautions they need to. But more importantly, they're outside getting some fresh air, they're stretching their bodies. And the fact that 25 instead of 6 showed up, just, I think, makes us know that the students really welcome the opportunity to do that. The other thing is collaborating with other offices on campus. One of the best things I think we did in the fall was our students with student leadership and engagement play bingo. And it gets a great turnout. And so we did it in collaboration with student engagement. We did a bingo night, And we asked them to bring their pets. And if they didn't have a pet, bring a stuffed animal. And it was wonderful. And interspersed, we had a DJ, and also interspersed with that, I gave tips on the value of play. So they would take a break and I'd talk about the value of play, what play does for our bodies, our minds, how it keeps us young. So we had, there was a lot going on, but it was one of the most fun nights I ever had during this pandemic. People had somebody had their fish tank on, somebody else had their turtle. They did have stuffed animals. And then the other thing that was great was students, family members participated. So when they took a break and the DJ played, you saw whole families, like mom, dad, and a sister and a brother dancing to the music together. You know, when they were playing bingo, it might be, you know, their little sister sitting with them as they're playing bingo. Dad is on the sofa, they're playing bingo, and dad's face comes into the camera. He smiles and goes back out of the camera. And so that was one of the best things. And it was a simple collaboration with student leadership and engagement. And we actually sent out teddy bears. They chose this camouflage teddy bear to send out. I forget what the name was. We named it. And it had a t-shirt on it that said, "Be kind." So some students had received that bear, and that bear was actually on camera also. So there are ways of doing it, but it really takes a lot of thinking out of the box and think about collaborating with other areas on campus. We don't have to do it by ourselves.
The only thing I potentially could add to all these wonderful things that these women have just shared would be the timing of everything, though, too. Is that, you know, historically, I would say a lot of wellness programming on campuses were these like 7 p.m. kind of things, and people would show up at night. That does not work right now with you. Like, you know, people, once you've logged off for the day, you're not logging back on at 7 o'clock at night. And so there's been some challenges around that. I'm reading in the chat that's going on right now, they're talking about how they're doing micro programming within classes. If somebody goes into an actual class and does a little bit of programming as part of that class, like those kinds of moments at Jefferson within our medical school, there's 2 times during the day where people will actually attend stuff. One is noon to 1 because their schedules are they're never scheduled between noon and 1. And the other time is at 5 o'clock because they're scheduled to go until 5. So they'll hang on for another hour. But if you expect them to come back in, even at 5:30, you've lost them. So it's about, if it has to be virtual, if it has to be online, like when you do it is almost as important as how you do it. But the, you know, what Margaret and Georgette were talking about, how you do it is so important. It has to be interesting. It has to be short. It has to be targeted and yeah.
Yeah, those are all great, especially coming from the student affairs area. The timing has been a struggle for us as well in programming. And those are great points. I love the getting into the classroom piece. We've done that a couple times with some sessions, and they've probably been the most successful. So it's a really good point, Matt. We do have another question in our chat. Are your counseling staff members completing accommodation documentation for your students? Many students are not able to afford mental health services outside of the university setting.
So maybe just to ask for some clarification in reference to accommodations in terms of, like I know we have students that, you know, are requesting documentation for like emotional support animals, for example. There's sort of, you know, disability services, there's academic accommodations. Was this question kind of asking about one of those types of accommodations specifically?
She said mental health services.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if we certainly make efforts to connect students with mental, whether that's on campus or, you know, through our campus services or off campus, if they can't afford services off campus, you know, there are even sometimes options there in terms of agencies that offer either FQHC or FQHC, excuse me, agencies that offer services regardless of somebody's ability to pay, or there are agencies that will like assist students with getting set up with, for example, like Medicaid plans, et cetera. But I think that, I don't know if this is too general a way to answer that question, but I think that, in general, campuses and campus counseling centers are always trying to actively help students connect with services in whatever way they can. And we know that there are challenges and barriers there, but so that whatever documentation they are needing, so whether that's, maybe that's psychoeducational documentation because they need to apply for academic accommodations or things like that, working with them and figuring out the ways in which that can be, accessible, within their means. And I think it's important for us as professionals to always be trying to expand our knowledge about what is available in the community. What are the agencies that are offering sliding fee scale, plans for those that aren't insured, et cetera.
Yeah, I would just agree with what Margaret said. We're always offering, and we do have people that we refer our students to who do take sliding scale, or they may have graduate interns, and so they don't have to. A student wouldn't have to pay the full fee to be seen in those instances. And we have our nurse practitioner, and so if it's a need for them to seek those kinds of services. For some students, they don't have the money or they may not take the insurance. We have an occasion when it's been an emergency and it's serious enough, we've even taken it out of our budget to pay for that student to see our nurse practitioner who has a focus on psychiatric care. We've taken it out of our budget so that that student can be seen and evaluated or a med check with that person. So yeah, we do. We definitely do those things, make accommodation.
Well, thank you very much. We are running a little bit over time, so I do have one quick question for Margaret. What is the name of the medical software you used with telehealth add-on?
Yeah, sure. So I researched quite a few when I was looking to go in that direction for my office. And there are some great ones out there. And Georgette, I think maybe you mentioned Titanium. That was one that I looked at for sure. Titanium is very comprehensive, and that's one that is specifically designed for college counseling centers. But the one that I use is not specifically designed for college counseling centers, but it's a Simple Practice. And I just found that to be very user-friendly. And I liked that I could customize a lot of the forms and note formats to fit with the system that I kind of already was using and just make it electronic. So, but there are a lot of ones out there. I've also heard of folks using therapy notes. Theranest, I think, is one of them. Again, Matt and Georgette, you might know a few others, but Simple Practice does have an add-on of the telehealth, which I really like too. And I don't know about some of those other ones, and if they have that option. I don't believe Titanium does. I don't know about some of those other ones, but the telehealth, it is an additional fee, but it was a very smooth transition then because then everything was all in the same place. And I did appreciate the convenience of that.
Thank you. So I have one quick little housekeeping thing to read, and then we will wrap up. So we'd love for you to join us now in the networking area where you'll be able to chat with colleagues. To do so, you just simply click the networking on the left side of your screen and click the blue ready button when you're ready to be randomly matched with another attendee. It will be a video chat by default, but if you want to turn off your video by clicking the icon, you can choose. If you will have up to 3 minutes to chat, but you may click the extend button if you both would like to chat longer. You can also end the chat before the 3 minutes is up by clicking leave. If you both click the blue connect button at the top of the screen, you'll be able to view each other's email addresses in the connections section of your Hopin account. Also, before you leave the event, please be sure to check out our sponsors and complete our brief post-session evaluation. Both can be found in the reception area. Just click on the sponsor's logo to visit their website. And if you've enjoyed our session and are interested in joining the committee, please submit the interest form linked in the reception area as well. And if you haven't registered for the rest of the sessions held each Friday morning this month, just go to dvsac.com for program information and registration links. I just want to thank all of our presenters today. This was truly an amazing panel. I learned a lot. I have a lot of sticky notes with notes on them, and I'm sure my staff do too. We really appreciate you taking time out of your day to be here and just giving us your knowledge. We really appreciate it. So have a good rest of your day. Have a great weekend, and happy Valentine's Day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me.